This week on the Alex Salmond Show, the ambassador of controversy, Her Majesty's representative in Uzbekistan to radical blogger. It's the story of Craig Murray. Join us to hear the conclusion on air and online.
Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, where we're continuing with an occasional series on the people behind the top 10 political blogs in the country. Today we resume our exclusive interview with controversial blogger Craig Murray. His story has taken him from the heart of the UK Foreign Office establishment to becoming one of the most radical political bloggers across these islands. In the show last week, we heard how the glittering prizes of his career in the Foreign Office were snatched away by his determination to oppose the abuses of human rights in Uzbekistan, where he was posted as the then youngest UK ambassador in the diplomatic service.
But the moment they tried to blackmail me, then I wasn't going to go under any circumstances, and then they'd got themselves into a fight, because I was absolutely furious, as you might imagine.
In this show, we complete the story of how he came back to public prominence as a fierce anti-establishment critic in one of the UK's most followed political blogs.
The largest number of viewers I've ever had for an individual article was 1.2 million on my own blog. And you must remember that, of course, you can multiply that because popular articles are always reproduced all over the internet.
But first, your tweets, messages and emails, and a terrific response we've had to part one of Craig Murray's interview last week. Gavin says, that was a very revealing and enlightening interview on the show. Thank you for taking part. Arthur says, Craig Murray, a great guest. Thanks so much for the podcast version of the show. A great innovation. I can now listen while on the move, usually on my bike over here in Denmark. Thank you, Arthur. Scotland's Prerogative says, excellent interview. Looking forward to hearing part 2 next week. Lynn says, what an amazing interview. So happy Craig wants an independent Scotland. Amanda says, you all need to listen to the show. The interview with Craig Murray certainly shows what unscrupulous governments do to protect themselves. William says, wow, the British and American atrocities just keep coming and getting worse. Jim says, excellent video, should be compulsory viewing. Robert says, this must be one of the most interesting programmes currently. Louise says, sadly, determination to tackle lies, manipulation, bullying, greed, hypocrisy tends to lead to paying a heavy price. I'm glad Craig Murray persists. And finally, Mary says, love watching your show and you give interesting topics. Thank you, Mary. Craig Murray, his Foreign Office career in tatters, his personal life in chaos, and his health in jeopardy. Alex takes up the story with him on how he found a new platform on social media.
I'm talking today to Craig Murray, once our man in Tashkent, Her Majesty's ambassador to Uzbekistan, and now one of the foremost bloggers in the land. Craig, you continued as this figure outside, well outside the establishment now, even although as the Iraq war came to a conclusion and people started to emerge. I mean, the Iraq war was interesting. There was huge opposition before it started. Then there was a period where the opposition was muted, and then the doubts started to emerge. And as people realised the extent of the false trail of intelligence, then many of the views which had looked controversial, even crackpot, started to suddenly gain currency.
But that's very true. I was vindicated, if you like, in public in my assessment of the value of the intelligence. I used to be head of the FCO unit responsible for surveillance of Iraqi attempts at weapons procurement. So I knew very well that the dossier on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction was nonsense. And I confirmed it with people, including people who had been involved in writing it. So I had known all along, even from within the office, and even from literally the day it was produced, that the intelligence on Iraqi WMD was fake.
But then you got electoral validation, if you're looking for, not from a parliamentary constituency, but from your old university in Dundee, where you were elected Lord Rector, a very interesting and well, unique aspect of the old university system in Scotland, where the head of the university is an elected post, elected by the students in the main, but some university students and staff. So Dundee University elected you as the Lord Rector. How did you feel about that?
Well, I thought it was great to come back as rector, especially 20 years or 25 years after the university had amended its charter to stop me holding any posts in the university. It was.
And who invited you to stand and why?
I was invited by some students who were against the war in Iraq and who had seen me as a champion for anti-war views they could put up as a candidate for rector in a university which was very establishment dominated and in which the administration had rather close ties to New Labour.
And of course you were up against, as one of your main opponents, somebody rather more formidable than a politician, one of Scotland's sporting stars, a very famous rugby player. So how was that contest? I mean, how did you debate weapons of mass destruction? And what was the Scotland's International's response to it?
It was, Andy Nicol was my major opponent in the election. The position of rector, in my view, is very important because it gives the students a real say in the running of the university. The university administration much more interested in just having celebrity rectors who will purely carry out a PR role, but won't intervene on questions like tuition fees or class sizes or costs of student accommodation.
But it hasn't worked out for the University of Dundee because they've had a succession of rectors on the radical side of politics, because I think Brian Cox, the well-known actor, is one of your successors in Dundee.
Exactly. No, I'm happy to say that I started a new chain of activist rectors. The rector before me was Lorraine Kelly.
A very nice and effective television interviewer, of course. But nonetheless, so there you are. You've established this position in a way vindicated and validated by the student body, but nonetheless, your position against torture, which everybody should support, but establishing them, because by then had not a subsequent Foreign Secretary amended the official position about illegal rendition. So your views are taken sway, but you continued to pursue the radical end of politics. And I'm quite interested as to why, having established your position, been vindicated in large measure, you didn't then say, well, perhaps it's time to look at a more establishment political career, or perhaps did you?
No, I don't think I ever considered looking for a mainstream career again. I felt I'd done that and done it very successfully in many ways. So what I'd seen, the actions of the state in, obviously, its complicity in torture, in falsifying the evidence on Iraqi WMD, had led me to the conclusion that the British state itself was something which needed to be undermined. It was not a tool for good in the world. I'd had a belief in Scottish independence really since my student days, when I'd been a good friend of Gordon Wilson, who was then leader of the SNP, and who I had actually proposed as a candidate to be rector of the university successfully, and was rector in my time. And Gordon had really converted me to Scottish independence. And I started to see Scottish independence not only as something desirable in itself, but as the tool which would break up the United Kingdom and then cause real problems for the neo-imperialist, neo-conservative foreign policy being pursued by the US and the UK.
So you're an abiding attachment to Scottish independence, because as a radical liberal student, you invited the leader of the Scottish National Party, the Member of Parliament for Dundee East, to stand for rector of the university. So the Scottish independence, you weren't a Johnny-come-lately to Scottish independence, but you returned to Scotland in 2014 to help in the referendum campaign led by some guy whose name I can't remember, but nonetheless a very exciting and turbulent time in Scottish politics. So what was your role in the campaign, and how did you feel that did the campaign vindicate your hopes that radicalism would be alive in the country of your forebears?
I'd come up in, I think, 2012 and 2013 to speak to a couple of bodies like the Scottish Independence Convention, start giving speeches on independence. The end of 2013 onwards, I started to do more and more. And by the time the referendum was called, I was working almost full-time on it. And I decided, well, I'd better move up to Scotland. And I gave a large number of speeches all around the country during the campaign. And the excitement of it, the tremendous feeling of community involvement, and the fact, ordinary people who hadn't previously taken much interest in politics were coming out and talking not just about independence, but about what kind of society they wished Scotland to be post-independence. It was the most invigorating experience of my entire life. The communal feel of it was just fantastic. And to be in the middle of that campaign, and to be living through a period that felt revolutionary, day and night, and a time when political ideas from the radical side of politics were very openly being canvassed and discussed in the street. It was a life-forming experience for me. It came rather later in my life, but it absolutely transfigured my view of what a good life is and what we should do and how we should work in society.
And you sought to be an SNP candidate in the 2015 election. Unfortunately, your hopes were dashed by the vetting committee, who perhaps found you a bit hot to handle.
Yeah, that's one of the the many disappointments of my life. In fact, after my activity in the referendum campaign, 13 constituency associations of the SNP, their executives, invited me to put myself forward as a candidate in 13 different constituencies. My great worry was working out, which ones to go for, really. But then I was turned down by the Central Vetting Committee on the grounds they said that they could not be sure that I would follow party discipline. And of course they were quite right. I wouldn't follow party discipline, but whether
I think they should have given you pass marks for honesty at the interview.
Well, exactly. I didn't lie in the vetting meeting. Maybe I should. But
well, I think the general form, and when people are asked the question, will you always abide by the party whip and party discipline, you're meant to say yes to that, an answer to that question. But you must have been buoyed to see the SNP elect 56 MPs out of the 59 constituencies. But by then, of course, you had found another outlet for your views at this incredibly successful blog, which, how many dedicated followers does it have now, Craig?
It's around the 300,000 unique visitor mark. But individual blog articles might get as much as 1.2 million people.
1.2 million. Now, did you have any conception, either when you started the blog or when you first encountered the social media revolution, that you would end up writing one of the most popular and well-read blogs on the planet, for that matter? Although I suspect some of these 1.2 million might be your old colleagues in the Foreign Office just checking on what you're up to.
It's certainly widely read by quite a lot of people in the Foreign Office. I started it actually, but nobody noticed, back when I was standing against Jack Straw in Blackburn. And I remember, if we got 300 people in a day to read it, I was really excited. The idea that you would be getting up towards millions seemed, absolutely impossible.
And then, in the run-up to 2014, a Scottish independence referendum arrives, and you return to the land of your forebears to campaign in it, and by then you've established an extraordinarily successful blog, the Craig Murray blog. These are the issues we're going to discuss in the second part of this interview.
Welcome back. Alex is interviewing top political blogger Craig Murray. We take up the story with Craig launching one of the best supported political blogs in the country.
Craig, we've been talking about the issues that have been discussed in your blog. Some of these, what's the one you've been most proud of? Well, let's look over the last year or two. What's the issue you think has, either elicited the greatest response, or where you think you've said something that meant a great deal to people?
The largest number of viewers I've ever had for an individual article was 1.2 million on my own blog. And you must remember that, of course, you can multiply that because popular articles are always reproduced all over the internet. And that was an article on the Panama Papers, which were released giving details of people's offshore banking and tax dodging activities.
And this had ramifications across a range of countries. I mean, even countries unexpectedly like Iceland were caught up in this release of information.
It did. But the point which I made was that there was a quite extraordinary lack of Americans featuring in these Panama Papers, and no major companies or no major individuals in either the UK or the US, and that this was wildly improbable. And in fact, the full Panama Papers never were published. There has never been an unredacted release of the...
Well, certainly they weren't being suppressed by WikiLeaks, which by its nature does not suppress things. So who's got them?
Well, the Panama Papers weren't released by WikiLeaks. They were released by a group called the Committee of Investigative Journalists, because the source who got them gave them not to WikiLeaks, but to a German newspaper who shared them through this journalistic cabal. And the newspapers redacted them. And the point which I was making about it was it being much better if they'd been given to WikiLeaks or just released direct for net, so we could actually see the raw material. And it did feel very much like it was very selective in terms of what material was being released and what material was being highlighted. And the idea of releasing through the mainstream media is not a sensible way if you want to get secrets out into the public.
So that was your most popular, most read blog in recent times. One of the most controversial, of course, has been your views on the Skripals and the Salisbury poisoning. Do you think you would, given what's been known, you would adjust any of your conclusions?
I don't think it's been proven who they were, and it's worth noting that the arrest warrant for them has not been amended into the names of the people supposedly identified by Bellingcat. But they plainly were not the innocent tourists they were made out to be. My own belief is we really do not know what happened. The British government story is absolutely full of holes. I did an article about a month ago on 10 points that I don't believe on the Skripal story, and nobody's been able to refute or even attempted to refute those 10 points. And
that's one of the great controversies of the time. But other recent features in your blog, the Chagos Islands, which the show has done a couple of programmes on. I read your blog on the Chagos Islands, and what stood out from other reports was that you had clearly looked at every iota of the International Court of Justice judgment, which seems like a rather obvious thing for journalists to do, but you'd certainly done it. Why do you think it is in the conventional news media are not prepared or able to devote the time to have that textual examination of what the ICJ were about when they issued a stinging condemnation of the treatment of the Chagos Islanders?
I spent over 60 hours reading every detail, not just of the ICJ opinion and the advisory opinions, but all the legal judgments in the UK from the Supreme Court and the High Court and all the parliamentary debates, and just researching. And sadly, in the corporate media, they're no longer prepared to put the kind of resource into investigative journalism that's required to get that depth of knowledge and understanding of the subject. I should say, I was horrified by the things I discovered myself and by just how Machiavellian the machinations of the British government have been.
Well, that, of course, has been established by the ICJ. But another thing, I mean, isn't there a potential criticism, or isn't there a criticism that people would make, many of your erstwhile colleagues perhaps, that you look at every issue and always assume the worst of the British authorities or the American authorities? I mean, take your recent activities in support of Julian Assange. Isn't there another side to the argument? Might there not be something in the view that, willingly or unwillingly, the WikiLeaks process has been used to undermine as opposed to consolidate democracy?
On the first question, I don't think I inevitably take an anti-Western line, let me put it that way. For example, on the Ukraine, my views are closer to the Western line than they are to the Russian line, just to give that as one example. On WikiLeaks, we should remember that WikiLeaks first came to real prominence with the release of the Afghan and Iraqi war logs, which gave enormous detail of actual definite war crimes and of the dreadful things that are being done in our name. My Chagos article drew on a WikiLeaks leaked American diplomatic cable which detailed a meeting between British and American diplomats where they were making up this idea of declaring an environmental protection zone, a maritime protection zone around.
And that is relatively recent, of course. For
Chagos.
people who think the Chagos Island story just speaks ill of one of my great heroes, Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister of the 60s and 70s, that particular episode was much, much more recent. That was the most recent Labour government activities with the Americans to the detriment of the Chagos Islanders.
That's right. And David Miliband was dressing up as environmentalism the exclusion of the islanders from their islands on the grounds they would be fishing, which is appalling. But it was absolutely cynical. They stated in terms in that meeting that the environmental lobby is stronger than the Chagos lobby. Therefore, this was a good political move to justify excluding the islanders from their own island.
And is your determination now to keep crusading on these causes, that your blog will still be there, that without fear or favour, exposing what you can of the truth and giving your trenchant opinions?
Yeah, I certainly intend to carry on. I would say I don't expect everyone to agree with everything on my blog. I possibly don't agree with everything on my blog. The idea is to provoke thought and give alternative viewpoint, but a well-researched and grounded, always, viewpoint. And that I intend to keep on doing.
In your career, if you looked at, have there been politicians, not necessarily establishment politicians, but politicians in establishment office who you've looked for great? I'm thinking actually Robin Cook and the ethical foreign policy which he attempted to pursue from 97 onwards. Now, that came to an end through internal machinations. But do you think that would have been a credible and possible stance, strategy for a British Foreign Secretary to pursue, or do you always think that forces, one way or another, would have pulled the rug from under it?
No, I think Robin Cook was essentially a good man and was trying to do the right thing in seeking a foreign policy based on morality, and came close to succeeding in some ways, but was, of course, stymied by Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell in many ways. And in fact, within a couple of weeks of his taking office, he was overruled at Cabinet on the sale of Hawk jets to Indonesia, where they were being used for bombing against East Timor. So he was always fighting an uphill battle against the forces of evil. I think it's not too strong a term that were dominating New Labour.
Was there a feeling in the Foreign Office when Robin Cook became Foreign Secretary, look, here's something new, different, there might be a chance to pursue a different approach to things? Or was there just trepidation that a lot of people might be asked to behave out of type?
I think the majority view in the Foreign Office was hostile to Robin Cook and to the idea of a more moral foreign policy. The people in the Foreign Office like to see themselves as practicing realpolitik and being the masters of dark arts of diplomacy. And the balance of opinion inside the Foreign Office is actually quite right-wing, contrary to popular myth. There were a few of us who were extremely hopeful. And I had joined the Foreign Office straight from university, and then I'd spent 12 years working for Tory governments. After that period of time, the chances of a change were very invigorating for many of us. But unfortunately, although he tried to do the right things in many ways, he was going to allow the Chagos Islanders back to the Chagos Islands, for example. But that's precisely the kind of reason why he was eventually forced out of the job.
I know, my sources tell me that recently you've been on a cricketing tour of Pakistan. And among your other lead cricketers who were on that tour was Peter Oborne, an extremely prominent journalist. I'm just interested in how you and Peter got on in that trip. And also, did you win the games?
No, I don't think we won any games. But Peter and I get on very well. We have common beliefs, particularly in civil liberties. Peter's a very old-fashioned kind of Tory, which sadly is becoming extinct in many ways, I think, who has firmly rooted right-wing views, but does believe in freedom, does believe in individual liberty, and does believe in social conscience. And I've never chosen my friends by their, by having similar political views to me. Otherwise, maybe I wouldn't have many friends.
So what you're telling me is that somebody from the radical edge of commentary and somebody as a conservative libertarian by principle, even these forces combined, couldn't win a single game in Pakistan.
I'm afraid that's true. We were bamboozled by spin of a different kind.
Craig Murray, I can't win any cricket games for you, but what I can do is present you with the Quake. As a Scot through and through, you've got no doubt what you do with the Quake. Whiskey in the Quake, round all with your many, many friends. And you can always blog about it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
We hope that this in-depth interview with Craig Murray has offered an insight into the character of one of the most trenchant critics of UK foreign policy and fiercest advocates for the global protection of human rights. His blog is not flashy and the site pretty rudimentary in social media terms. Its popularity is sustained on content alone. He has often been criticised as a conspiracy theorist, and Craig himself admits that some of his theories have proven to be mistaken. Trouble is for his critics that a number of his conspiracies have also turned out to be based on fact rather than fiction. His dogged pursuit of human rights has cost Craig Murray very dear in personal terms. However, information obtained by torture has been shown to be both unreliable and counterproductive, while extraordinary rendition has been exposed in both the legislatures of the USA and the UK. If there is a sadness, it is this. Once the UK Foreign Office seemed to recruit a measure of free spirits, clearly they are now considered too hot to handle. Is the administration of UK policy better served as a result? I would doubt it. One of the key justifications for social media is that it provides a platform for those who challenge the comfortable assumptions of the establishment. We should take care that open access to it is not lost or compromised, because many contributors have much to offer. Murray's pen roams far and wide, but much of his content is focused on Scottish politics. His position then in the UK's top 10 bloggers is a significant achievement. Next week, we cast our net across the Irish Sea to interview another top blogger who's attracted a huge audience by providing insight into the inside stories of the politics of Northern Ireland. Alex interviews the man behind the memorably named blog, Slugger O'Toole. But for now, from Alex, me and all of the team here, it's goodbye for now, and we'll see you next week.